You're listening to World of Empowerment Radio, your station for practical spirituality in a changing world. And here are your hosts, Aingeal Rose and Ahonu.
You are very welcome back. I am Ahonu, and with me is Aingeal Rose, and you're welcome to the Honest to God series, where today we are speaking about loss. Now, as is always when we ask these kinds of deep questions, we do like to go into the Akashic records and ask Source, what is Source's definition of loss? But some of the other things we want to cover today are about why do we go through loss? Is it a necessary form of learning? And many people say that joy is the same as sorrow. We're going to ask that question. We're also going to find out about why there are huge transformations through loss, and is it meant to be that way, and is there a better way to have transformations? We want to know about how loss affects the body. We want to know if loss is predestined or predetermined, and is it connected to karma, and why don't we choose to learn through joy rather than through loss? And we want to look then for a healing way to look at loss. So we have a lot ahead of us today, and let's get stuck into these questions, Aingeal Rose.
All right, Ahonu, so begin.
So our first one is, what is Source's definition of loss?
All right, well, I'm seeing a lot of purple light when you ask this question, and it's the deep kind of purple. So just give me a second then. The first answer I'm getting is loss is the temptation to perceive yourself as guilty. Because the feeling I have from this purple light is there's quite an emotion in it. And the emotion is perceiving yourself as guilty. Loss is connected to the perception of guilt. In other words, it does come back around to our thoughts about what we deserve, our thoughts about God. I didn't think we were going to get into this level of it, Ahonu, but
No, right, but we've got to go there.
This is where we're going. Okay, that it exists. Loss exists because we don't believe we're worthy. And interesting when I say that loss exists because we don't believe we're worthy, I feel like that encompasses all experiences of loss. Whether it's the death of a loved one, or it's a loss of prosperity, or you lose your home, or any kind of loss, really. It looks like it's definitely connected to our sense of worthiness, our perceptions of ourselves in terms of who do we think we are, how do we view our lives, how do we view ourselves in it. So that's what Source is telling me is the cause of loss, or the way we experience loss, that it wouldn't be happening at all if we didn't have a mindset of guilt. And I find that interesting. I feel like Source is equating it with death itself, the whole idea of death. They're connected to each other in the sense of we believe in death, and you wouldn't believe in death if you knew that the truth is everything is eternal life and is meant to be blissful. I find this an interesting direction that Source is taking us, because it really does go very deeply in the sense of how complex a consciousness is, how many things go on in it without us being aware. In other words, every single moment we are thinking and deciding and judging and believing things about ourselves, and it happens so fast that we don't even know what we thought, what conclusion we came to, and how that's affecting not only ourselves but the whole world, consciousness itself. Okay, that there are these intricate levels of these underpinnings of worry that we all have about how are we doing? How are we doing in life? How are we doing in the world? We're always measuring ourselves against something. And that very process of doing that has as a natural consequence guilt. I should have done this better. I should be more along now. I mean, you can see it, a subtle little example of that is, I don't know if you've ever noticed when people want to eat something that the collective thinks isn't good for them. Piece of cake. We'll use a piece of cake, right? Or a sweet. And people want to have it, right? And then let's say most of the time they don't choose it. But, the times that they do choose it, if you're at a party and somebody's eating something like that, they'll apologize first. They'll say, oh, I shouldn't be having this, but, it's a party. Or you'll find that they're making an excuse for eating it before they even eat it. And with that is this whole unconscious, oh, I'm bad if I eat that. I should, it's already degradation on the self and feeling like you have to have an excuse, a justification for enjoying something. When the truth is why not just enjoy it without any sort of guilt? Have it or don't have it, but enjoy it. That's this very small, very mundane level. But when you take that into how we all subconsciously measure ourselves and compare ourselves to everything we experience, that's why there's so many contrasts in the world. Everything is diversified. We're always comparing and measuring ourselves against that, mostly subconsciously. But Source is saying that loss is really connected to punishment. Because whenever you measure and you think you're not doing as well as you should be, or even judging another person as doing better than you or less than you, you will experience loss, because all of that type of thinking demands punishment. Guilt demands punishment on some level. And what I'm perceiving through all of this is there's this whole underpinning, this whole beneath the surface world that goes on in that way that brings things about in the physical world that we're not even consciously aware of. But what I hear Source saying is in every minute you're judging and comparing. You read about somebody who's doing successful in business and you start comparing yourself to how well you're doing in comparison to them, and oh, you should have been doing that, or you should have known that. Or on the other flip side, oh, I'm doing better than them. And okay, there's all this judging going on and comparing, and it has to do with everything: clothing, food, relationships, religions, how you behave. I'm more loving than that person. They're more loving than me. The whole game is in there, the whole thing. And it happens subtly, and it happens all the time, what Source is saying, constantly underneath the surface of your consciousness. So when we bring about loss, see, there's so many levels of this, I'm realizing, Ahonu, just with this question, that to the biggest extreme, when a person dies, for example, their death is a result of their consequence of their sum total of judgments against themselves. And we see this too when you talk about the possibility of physical immortality, the whole idea, let's just say the idea that could it be possible that you wouldn't have to go through a death process of any type in your life? Not physically, not emotionally, not mentally. Source is saying it's entirely possible, and we'll go into that in a minute. What would that actually be like? But most people, when you mention that possibility, right away they defend death. Oh, well, this is the natural way. This is the way of nature. This is, people are blissful when they die, and they'll defend death. So we're definitely addicted to death in all its forms. We accept it as normal, as part of nature. And if you say anything to the contrary about that, then someone needs to defend it. So this concept that Source is saying, this is huge, much bigger than I thought we were going to be getting into today with this answer, that there's a whole world, a whole perception of reality that is based on loss in this way. Loss is to be expected in this world because of the way we think and believe about it.
Okay, our next question, Aingeal Rose. And in a way, Source's definition of loss answers quite a number of these, but let's be clear about them. Why do we go through loss? So I understand we're going through loss because we feel guilty, we believe in guilt, we manifest the loss in order to keep us believing in it. We believe in death, and that's why.
Yeah, it's really a form of punishment.
Yeah.
Any kind of loss is really a form of punishment on some level.
Many people say that joy is the same as sorrow. Is that correct?
I'm getting no, it's not the same as sorrow. And I actually feel like Source is saying, how could it be? How could it be? Okay, because no, they're not the same at all. One is a total different experience. They're very different experiences, okay?
Yeah. I think perhaps where the question is coming from is that there's such a thin line, there's such a narrow divide between one moment being in joy and another moment being in sorrow. And I think that's perhaps why people have blurred the line.
Well, I think, and this could be leading into some of our other questions, I think why people may think that is because it is true that out of loss and sorrow can emerge blissful states of consciousness or shifts in consciousness or a much bigger opening, let's just say. And I think that may be where some of that may come from.
Okay, our next question. Many people have huge transformations through loss. Is it meant to be that way? And I think this question is coming from, is it meant to be that way in general? I know that some particular people would set it up that way because they have some particular lesson that they want to experience. But in general, is loss meant to create transformation? Is it designed that way?
Well, we have to be very careful here because Source has not designed it that way. So that's the first perspective from Source, that Source didn't create loss so that you could have a transformation. However, transformation does occur from loss, precisely because it jars a consciousness. It shocks a consciousness when somebody goes through a loss, something that impacts them emotionally to such a degree that it jars their whole perception of reality. So, let's say you're moving along in your life and everything is going status quo. And from within your own being, there's a lot to this, because on the one hand, the spirit that we are always desires greater expansion of consciousness. So if you're tooling along in your life and you're going along status quo, and let's say you're not really growing, you're not expanding, the natural design of your spirit will push, kind of like roots that break through concrete or water that breaks through a crack in a dam. Your spirit is going to want to break forth and emerge into something greater than itself. That natural urge is there, and you could say that is the God part of us. That's the spirit part of life that just naturally does that. But the way that comes about does not have to be through tragedy. It is through tragedy for a lot of us because of everything I just described, because our consciousness is predominantly a guilt-oriented consciousness. And as long as we have that paradigm of measuring and comparing and judging, we're going to create in our lives some sort of scenario that will jar us into a greater liberation. And I think that most often, for a lot of people, that does come about through sorrow of some type, some sort of loss, okay? Predominantly, I'm saying. I'm not saying that people never learn through joyful experiences. I'm saying that the majority of the circumstances in this world come through some sort of drastic shock of some type. Yes, the fact that you can look back and you can say, well, because I went through that particular experience, that opened up this whole new thing for me. I shifted my whole perception of my paradigm, and that led me into this new spiritual phase or this new opening in my life? Yes. So you could say that loss does catalyze that. Absolutely. But we only go through loss itself because we have it geared in. We're wired. We have to think cause and effect, right? Cause and effect at the level that we're at still as a consciousness on earth is that it's still predominantly under the umbrella of a God, of some sort of authority figure where judgment is a big part of it. All you have to do to see that this is true is just watch yourself for a day. Watch your thoughts. Watch how you perceive. Watch what you think about. How do you react, whether you're on Facebook, whether you're driving in a car, whether you're in a grocery store, whether you're in school. Just watch your reactions to things, and you'll see that the majority of your thoughts are in some sort of judging and comparing. Vibrationally, in terms of the law of cause and effect, we have it set up that when your spirit wants to shift and change and become bigger, it's going to create or be involved in some sort of event that'll shock you in order to crack the egg. Okay, in order to shift you out of your normal paradigm. But we don't, if our consciousness was different, we would be naturally bringing forth more and more blissful experiences of consciousness because our brain would be working differently, our whole, there wouldn't be any sort of interferences in there. We wouldn't be judging like we are. If we were in a consciousness that was more loving and accepting, and a consciousness that didn't have any desire for harm or retribution or get even consciousness or competition, if we had a consciousness that was just in love and acceptance, what would be happening is that flow of unlimited creativity would always be coming in. We'd always be, as the universe changes, as the depths of the cosmos change, we would be in alignment with those changes, and there would always be explosions in our consciousness of new life. So we would know that we didn't have to go through any sort of death process to experience that. Does that explain it?
It does. Aingeal Rose, this question is coming from my own experience because many of our listeners will know that both of us have had tragedies in our lives where indeed loss led to transformation. So in that sense we're qualified to talk about this, but so also is everybody, as we have found, or the majority of people on planet Earth, because we have believed in this paradigm and this cause and effect and this karmic influence that keeps coming round. But my question arises around, I'm asking this on behalf of listeners because thankfully I know the answer to this, but it's about when loss happens to us as opposed to, like in my case, for example, my first baby died on my birthday at 4 months old, and it seemed that it happened to me. In other words, that I was the victim of this. Now, I am very aware now that he was actually living his own life and had his own spiritual journey to go through, and that there was obviously some kind of cooperation going on whereby he was facilitating this shock aspect that you talk about so that I could learn, but also he was on his own journey. And the other thing that I learned from that experience was that we consider our babies and our children to always be babies and to be children, but in fact they can be old souls themselves. And indeed, if you were to put it in relative terms, they can be older than us, their parents. So they have their own experiences and their own spiritual lives that are unfolding that we don't take into account. But my question, though, in general, is loss, when it happens to us and we question, why me? What did I do to deserve this? What part did I play? Or what thoughts was I having that would allow such a tragedy to happen to me?
So are you asking me that question? I mean, in terms of your own thoughts that you would have had, I don't know that. I have no idea.
No. In general. I'm asking in general, for people in general. No, in other words, they could be... somebody might veer off the road and hit them head on and they weren't doing anything wrong. I'm just giving examples. Like in my case, I wasn't doing anything wrong. If somebody's driving along the road and somebody cuts across the median line and crashes into them, I say, well, look, I was on my right side of the road, I was doing everything perfectly, and somebody did this to me. You know what I'm asking? That loss.
Yeah, but I feel like I have to dissect this a little bit, okay? Because the bigger answer from Source is that we only perceive things as losses like that because we now think we're not in communication with that being anymore. For example, with your son, okay? When someone's taken out of your life physically, we perceive that as a loss because we perceive that as they are gone from us, okay? But the bigger way to look at that is that, well, no, they're not gone from you. There isn't any sort of gone. There's no separation. That being who was your son is still alive and well, just not in a body. So the loss we experience is that they're physically not in our presence anymore, and we've got this separation perception where we say, well, if they're not here physically, then we've lost them. Okay, but the truth is they've just shifted a form, and if we were in a different state of consciousness where we weren't in this divisive perception that we're in, like I just described, you would see that spirit form. It would be available to you. People do see ghosts. People do see spirits. It's rare, okay? But the point is that we'd be able to still be in communication with that being. The relationship wouldn't end, in other words, okay? If our brains and our consciousness weren't in this paradigm where we see things as objects and separate. That's the big answer, right? But I kind of have to use that big answer to answer this whole question because, like Source is saying, even for the people who come into our lives quickly and then leave, in the case of you, with your son coming in for a short period of time and leaving, or in my case, a husband that I had who left shortly after through death, those souls themselves, too, are still in that whole same paradigm that we're talking about. Because you wouldn't even come in and leave tragically in any way if you weren't yourself in some sort of consciousness like that. Like for my husband, he was shot to death, right? Now that would have to do with a lot of his past lives, probably. He probably had interactions with the particular person who shot him in other lifetimes. I'm sure that's true. But that's still all the same consciousness, you see, that we've been talking about. And he has a soul where whatever he is and what he's doing. So on the one hand, when you shift consciousness, okay, when you get out of those sorts of paradigms and thinking, right, you see things differently. You actually see things that you don't see now. You see at subtler levels. You see at more spiritual levels. There is no division between, well, this is the physical world and then you die, and only when you die do you see the spiritual world. There wouldn't be any division there, okay, if our consciousness was not in this very limited frame of reference that we're in. So when people do start to meditate, for example, and they start to go inward and they start to look at their beliefs and let go of certain things and let go of judgments, and all of a sudden they're quite sensitive to energies around them that they never knew were there, but were there all the time. Do you understand what I'm trying to get at? Okay, so I think it's all tied up in our perception of what we think reality is and how we see ourselves in that reality. That's where the pain comes from. It's us comparing ourselves to what was once and now is no more in our perception. The whole idea that it is no more is an illusion, but because we're not seeing at subtler levels, it appears as if whatever has gone from our frame of reference, has gone from our reality.
let's take a quick little studio break here, and we'll be right back after this break. Don't go away.
Years of research, thousands of profound statements, hundreds of sessions, miles of transcripts, months of listening, a vast archive of personal power and spiritual awareness awaits you. Join worldofempowerment.com today, a members-only website of practical spirituality for your fast-changing world. worldofempowerment.com.
Ahonu's book, The Reincarnation of Columbus, is his true story of the loss of his first child, his pain and struggle with grief, and the guilt that followed. It forms his entire philosophy of life, and is a superb rendering of the unfolding of spiritual awareness. The Reincarnation of Columbus is a true epic voyage from the pain and sorrow of a father's grief to a new world of empowerment, love, and forgiveness. Get your copy on Amazon.com or on Kindle for $2.99 by searching for AHONU, or visit http://thereincarnationofcolumbus.com. That's all one word, thereincarnationofcolumbus.com.
Okay, our next question. How does loss affect the physical body?
Well, if you register it as loss, and this is what we're at now, when you register something as loss, it is considered a trauma to the body. You know, every system is affected, every molecule, every cell, the pain registers in the physical body, but the pain comes from the perception of the spirit experiencing it. The body is the effect, and what happens to the body is adjusted by the consciousness of who's in it. So if you perceive a drastic loss as a horrible shock, yes, that same sort of shock is going to, manifest itself as a cascade of hormones and crystals that affect the body, and someone could get very ill from it, or which would be an obvious conclusion, okay? And when you start to heal your consciousness around something, then the body starts to get better as well. So it's all tied in together.
Okay.
In my case, Ahonu, back when the thing happened to me, I've often said that it was the thing that got me on a spiritual path, that particular event, because up until that time, and I was only 19 at the time, I was just planning on being a mom and having children. But that death in my life and the way that it occurred brought me to my first psychic, who opened up a whole new spiritual world. Now you can say, was that destined?
That was my very next question.
Is loss predestined? It could have been, actually. It could have been that the souls involved in the event, okay, all had some arrangement at some point to manifest particular things to move us along. But again, what I'm hearing from Source is that only happens because that's the perception of how you grow. But it doesn't have to be that way. But as long as there's this agreement in a collective consciousness that this is how it works, that's what will keep manifesting. And it has to do with all the souls involved. It's not just like in the case of yourself and the loss of your child. It's not just you experiencing that or him making the decision on his own independent of you, do you know?
Sure.
It's all one collective action.
But if you think, Aingeal Rose, for a moment, of the amount of logistics, let's call it, for want of a better way, to describe what's going on in the spirit world in terms of planning out all these experiences that we're creating ourselves for us to experience in advance. The amount of cooperation between souls and the amount of planning and organizing so that people meet up at certain times or meet up by accident or whatever, in order to create this lost scenario. I mean, it's astronomical.
But it's only because we're not learning any other way.
Yes.
Okay, and even if you look at the world...
But my point is, and I'm sorry for cutting across
that's
it, because
okay.
I want to clear it in my own head.
Mm-hmm.
It shows you how powerful we actually are.
Very powerful.
That we went to this incredible amount of creativity at some point to set up this loss event just so that we might get it.
Right.
Whereas we could have got it before without the loss.
Right.
Isn't that an amazing insight into how powerful we really are?
We look like we're heavily invested in death.
Yes.
I think even the Course in Miracles says something like, the fear of death is really its attraction.
Let me write that down.
Yeah. That's what the Course says. The fear of death is really its attraction. So in this conversation, I think it's interesting for us to be looking at why would we be attracted to loss? If like does attract like, and everything brings to itself that which it is, and again, this is from the most lofty to the most sorrowful, right? It's all a law of attraction. One would have to ask, why would you want to be attracted to a particular type of experience? And the normal conscious mind would say, oh no, I wouldn't. Who would want that? But again, if you start to do any sort of deeper investigation into your own subconscious mind, and you start to ask those types of questions, is why would I bring this to myself? And then I think part of it too could be the consequence of, generally we could say that we fall asleep on this planet, right? This would be a planet where people do have to constantly be catalyzed to wake up in one way or the other, right? In other words, we come in forgetting our past lives, for example, and there's even belief systems around that saying, well, that's the way it's supposed to be, that you're supposed to somehow come in here and forget who you were and what you've done in other lives. And there's all sorts of reasons, supposedly, why it's set up that way. But I've never thought that was true. I think forgetting is a consequence of stepping down into a lethargic world, or a world that's only at a particular place of evolution vibrationally. And how you can see that that's true is when you look at the new kids that are coming in, many of them come in remembering their other lives. So that barrier is thinning for them. So you can always see how that's changing. And when we look at this particular time cycle, in terms of whether you learn through joy or you learn through sorrow, a lot of what's happening in the cosmos, like the shifts that are going on in the universe, are causing people's DNA to activate at different levels, and they're waking up. Now, what do we mean by waking up? Well, it could be anything from all of a sudden they find that they're more psychic, or all of a sudden they're finding that they remember their other lifetimes, or they're aware at things at levels, or they might see a spirit in the forest, or suddenly they're hearing a tree communicate with them, where none of that happened before. That's an example of awakening through joy. Nobody had to go through sorrow for those activations to be occurring. The light itself coming from the cosmos is causing it naturally. And that's God's way, where those things would be happening through blissful events, not anything tragic or destructive. So there's a huge difference here. And even, too, just mentioning the Course in Miracles again, a lot of that book is just getting your mind to the point where you would get out of the victimizer perception, get out of guilt consciousness, and choose to learn through joy and bliss. And the fact that it makes it a choice demonstrates everything we're talking about today. That as a consciousness, we're choosing to still learn through loss, to still learn through tragedy. And you can see that, again, today being demonstrated all over the place. I mean, how horrific can we make it? How much of a horrible shock in order for us to jar us out of our complacency? Okay, when the truth is that we can choose to learn and change through joy, but we don't.
Now, let's bring in the subject of karma, Aingeal Rose, and let's just invent an example. Say I cut your arm off in a lifetime, and you come back now and you cut my arm off in this lifetime, let's say. So I'm mourning the loss of my arm. Is that a direct karmic connection? Or again, is that something that we have agreed to set up and for me to experience?
Well, karma doesn't mean that you have to experience the exact same thing that you did to somebody else. It doesn't mean that. The form could be very different. Okay. But you could set it up with yourself that in order for you to forgive yourself of something you've done, that you've chosen to go through that exact same thing in another lifetime in order for you to completely have compassion, let's just say, okay? It doesn't have to be that way, though, but it's only the belief in guilt that makes that happen. Do you understand? If you didn't believe that there was retribution to be paid or that there was an injury that was given, you wouldn't think that it had to be balanced out or paid back, okay? Now, the law of cause and effect will make sure it is, though, because like attracts to itself that which it is. In a way, this is all vibration.
Yes, and the energy...
And you wouldn't have hurt a person like that. You wouldn't have cut a person's arm off in the beginning if you didn't believe they were guilty of something or they were an enemy of some type. You wouldn't have done it.
Yes.
But because you did do it, it's carrying a particular vibration, and until that's balanced or neutralized...
And that vibration would have been created by the emotions around that and the pain and the thought
absolutely
forms around it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. You mentioned about a choice, making a choice about how we learn, to learn through joy or to learn through loss. At what point can we consciously make that choice? In other words, is it made before we're incarnated, or can we make that choice right now?
You can change your mind in any moment about anything at all. Even if you had set up a life plan or a contract to experience a retribution of some type, once you become conscious and aware of a dynamic of something, you can change your mind about it. And I think we set things up to make us aware or to make us more compassionate, you know. But I think what I'm trying to imply and what Source seems to be implying is that the way you learn about something is a choice. You can choose to continue to learn through loss and tragedy in order to be shocked into an awareness, or you can choose to learn through joy. The problem is that if you say to somebody, did you know that you are completely innocent, that you've never done anything wrong, that there's not one bad negative morsel in your body, that all there is purity and innocence, and you deserve to have everything you've ever desired, and that the answer is yes, that you can have whatever you want to experience, whatever you think would bring you joy and happiness, it's yes. The universe always says yes to you. Not no, but yes. Could you accept it? How much of it could you accept? Especially when you say you don't have to earn it. The gifts of God are free. You can experience it or have it just because that's the way it is. How many people could feel that they could actually accept and receive at that level without feeling like guilt for it, first of all? If you did have that happen, you know, would you feel guilty that you didn't have to work really hard for it or sacrifice in some way? How many people could embrace that unlimited possibility? And this makes the point, though, that when you say God's will for you is perfect happiness, and it means it, it doesn't mean God's will for you is, well, suffer first and then you'll have happiness, or sacrifice first, or go through some horrible tragedy and then you'll have happiness. It doesn't mean that. It says God's will for you is perfect happiness. So that means anything else is not God's will. But we will always learn, because the life impulse within us is to grow and expand. So we will always learn in direct proportion to our consciousness. And as long as our consciousness is a consciousness that believes in loss and tragedy and retribution and all of that stuff, that's how we're going to experience. That's how we'll grow, because that's the likeness.
That probably answers our final question that was about, is there a healing way to look at loss? And you've just outlined.
Yes, and I think the healing way is to not be judging it. That if we're still learning through loss, even though it's not the best way, it's not the happiest way, then in that we're actually on some level, because of the consciousness, choosing to learn that way. Anytime you're broken open and you become more of a loving being, and you can embrace life from a more sensitive perspective, I think that, I'm not going to say that's a wonderful thing, but it's definitely something more positive out of something that was potentially very tragic. And we know, too, that a lot of people, when they experience a loss or a tragedy, it can change a whole direction in their life. There are people who've gone through that have ended up totally changing their careers or creating organizations to help others. I mean, there's an unlimited amount of benefit that does come from loss. But in this whole picture, though, since we began by asking Source about it, Source would prefer we learn through joy. So as long as there's suffering in the world and tragedy in the world and downcast people and all of that, then anybody who creates a way to help those people lighten their load or have a happier life, those are all benefits that can come from loss. But did it have to be that way in the first place? Not if we were at a level of awareness where we were not in that consciousness that separates and judges and divides and measures ourselves against everything. Does that make sense?
I've taken some notes, Aingeal Rose, and I'd like to read through them by way of a summary of what we've covered today, unless there's anything you want to say in closing.
No, not right now.
Okay. Oh, I've got one final question before I go through it. You did mention at the very outset when we opened that you saw deep purple. Does it mean that deep purple is the colour of loss?
It is a colour of sorrow, yes.
Okay, now let me ask that question too, because it's also a colour of some religions. They use that colour supposedly as a colour of spirituality. So in a sense, is that colour connected to spirituality and to loss?
Well, it can be in terms of what you get out of it. For example, the Catholics would drape the statues in purple. Do you remember when you were coming around to Lent and to
yes.
the crucifixion and all of that? They'd cover everything in purple, and only on Easter would it all turn to white. Remember? Okay, but that's it. So purple can be associated with sacrifice and suffering and things like that.
So there's where the loss comes in. Okay, great. Okay, so you started off by saying that deep purple was the colour of loss. Loss is the temptation to perceive yourself as guilty. There is emotion in loss that is connected to guilt. Loss exists because we don't believe we are worthy. Loss would not exist if we did not believe in death. Everything is eternal life and is meant to be blissful. Loss is a complex unconscious experience of guilt without us being aware of its underpinnings. Loss and guilt are connected and demand punishment. In every moment, we are judging and comparing. A person's death is the sum total of the judgments against themselves. When we defend death, we defend loss and keep it in our experience. Loss is to be expected in this world because we believe in it. Joy is not the same as sorrow. Joy can emerge from loss through growth in awareness. Source has not designed loss as a tool for transformation. Loss shocks a consciousness, and that shock can lead to transformation. our God Spirit always wants expansion, but does not necessarily have to be through tragedy. In general, most transformation on earth comes from loss. Cause and effect is part of our belief in judgment. Our brains work differently in a loving, harmless environment. The death of a loved one makes us think we are not in communication and not in relationship anymore. Loss is the perception of division, but in truth there is no division in spirit. When we register a loss, it affects the physical body because our consciousness embraces all. Collective conscious agreements keep manifesting loss. We are so heavily invested in death that the Course in Miracles says that the fear of death is really its attraction. Forgetting is a consequence of stepping down in consciousness. Consciousness shifts cause changes in our DNA. Joy is an awareness of transformation without loss. As a collective consciousness, our world shows how invested we are in loss. Karma is connected to both loss and forgiveness. We can make choices and change our minds at any point in time. Knowing we are innocent is a huge aversion of loss. Can you accept you are innocent without feeling guilty? Loss of any kind is not God's will. We always learn in direct proportion to our consciousness. Forgiving and not judging loss is a way to heal from all perceptions of loss. There are unlimited benefits that can come from loss, but it is not at all necessary as a way to learn. Well now, Aingeal Rose, I have to say that was stunning and very transformative, even just coming into those realizations. So it does bring us to the end of our program today, and we would point you to subscribe on iTunes and Stitcher Radio, and also go to our website at worldofempowerment.com, where you can hear these podcasts, both from the Honest to God series that we do and also from Answers from the Akashic Records. And you will indeed find this podcast and all the previous ones on the website answersfromtheakashicrecords.com. So it's been a blessing having you with us. We appreciate you listening to us. And until next time, we send you our blessings and thanks from myself, Ahonu, and from Aingeal Rose.
Thank you, everybody. Talk to you next time.
You have been listening to Aingeal Rose and Ahonu on World of Empowerment Radio, your station for practical spirituality in a changing world.